He was always the one who stayed. Not out of loyalty, exactly, but out of a deep, almost instinctual fear of what would happen if he finally chose to leave. He just kept stocking the papers, booking the flights, and silently moving through the muted halls of her world. Tonight, though, the air felt different, thinner. She was asleep. A rare, almost unsettling peace settled over the cabin of the private jet, leaving Noah Reed alone with the low thrum of the engines and the vast, black silence of the Pacific Northwest rushing by beneath them. This silence, the narrator mused, was the cost of his control. A meticulous, self-effacing executive assistant at 27, Noah had crafted a life as rigid and clean as the edges of a fresh-pressed suit. Everything had its place, especially his own heart, tucked away, guarded, and entirely unnecessary for the job. Some stories only work because someone stays until the very end. If this one stayed with you longer than you expected, if you felt the quiet parts, leave a like so it doesn't disappear. Share it with someone who understands silence, and stay here because the stories that matter most are the ones we don't walk away from. Hey dear, welcome to Hearts Entangled, a gentle corner for love, healing, and the quiet stories we rarely find the courage to voice. If soft, lingering tales about human connection means something to you, then you're exactly where you belong. So before we dive in, do me a small kindness. Hit subscribe, tap the like button, and maybe hold something warm between your palms. This story wants you to feel with it. Because today's story might be the reminder your heart didn't realize it was waiting for. Now, let's begin. Noah looked across the aisle at Claire Hargreave, 42 years old, a legendary venture capitalist. To the world, she was a study in precision and detachment, a woman whose mere presence could shift millions. She was feared, yes, but mostly because she was simply elsewhere, too far removed in her ambition to be truly connected to anyone. Even now, asleep, she was formidable. Their working relationship was an edifice of rules, hierarchical, distant, and utterly professional. He was the buffer between her and a chaotic world, the quiet anchor in her hurricane of success. He kept the silence of her life intact, a silence he knew intimately because it mirrored his own. He remembered the moment he stopped creating things. It wasn't loud. After his family loss, the creative drive just flattened, replaced by the deep, practical need to control the fallout. Working for Claire gave him the perfect structure, a flawless execution of someone else's enormous ambition, which required nothing of his own. Suddenly, the gentle rhythm of the plane faltered. It was a small cough and the steady engine noise, just enough to catch Noah's attention. He glanced out the window at the churning black sky, the mountains below hidden by a thick, oppressive cloud layer. The San Francisco acquisition meeting was high stakes, stressful, and scheduled for dawn. This flight was meant to be the final controlled breath before the plunge. The cabin lights flickered. The cough became a tremor, and the air quickly turned cold with the metallic tang of fear. Claire awoke instantly, the stillness of sleep wiped clean by an emergency instinct. "Noah, what is that?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the rising wind outside. Before he could answer, the plane lurched violently, throwing them both into their seats as the nose dropped. The cabin was instantly plunged into chaos, the shriek of the wind, the blare of alarms, and the pilot's strained voices over the intercom, muffled by static. "Secure for emergency descent," a voice crackled. "Weather interference, mechanical failure. We are losing altitude fast." Claire, even now, maintained an impossible command. She reached for the survival kit, her movements sharp, strategic. "Stay strapped in, Noah. Focus. We are going to land this." But the descent was too fast, too vicious. The jet was caught in a brutal, invisible fist of extreme weather, being hammered down toward the rugged coastline. The precision that defined Claire Hargreave shattered under the relentless forces of physics. She gripped the armrest, her knuckles white, her famous detachment finally cracking, replaced by a raw human terror. Noah, though, felt only the deep, strange calm of surrender. This was the one thing he couldn't control. The jet slammed into the ground, not with an explosion, but with a horrifying, tearing screech of metal against rock, skidding for what felt like an eternity, then a sickening final thud. Silence returned, ragged and bleeding. When the dizzying nausea finally eased, Noah unbuckled himself, the smell of jet fuel and damp earth overwhelming him. The cabin was crushed, silent. He found Claire, bruised but conscious, her eyes wide, staring at the crumpled mess of the plane's forward section. He helped her climb out onto the fog-covered shore. The air was cold, tasting of salt and pine. The wreckage smoldered quietly behind them, a dark, smoking ruin against the gray cliffs. Both their phones were dead. They stood together, two survivors from two different worlds, now utterly isolated on an inaccessible stretch of Northern California coastline. They looked at each other not as boss and assistant, but simply as two terrified, breathing people. And in that moment they understood help was not coming anytime soon. The immediate quiet after the roar of the crash was not peaceful. It was demanding. It demanded everything they had. Survival mode took over instantly, but for Claire, it simply meant asserting her default position. "We stay here," she insisted, her voice tight, echoing her usual corporate certainty. "The wreckage is the beacon. Rescue crews are trained to look for the tail number. We wait, Noah." The sunlight, still a timid presence behind the coastal fog, did nothing to warm the argument. Noah felt the pushback well up inside him, a sensation entirely foreign to his controlled existence. He knelt, checking the damp, sandy ground. "We're inaccessible, Claire. Look at the cliffs. This isn't a beach, it's a coastal graveyard. And we need water, fresh water. We move inland." "Waiting is the strategic play," she countered, her ankle already twisting uncomfortably as she tried to keep her posture rigid. "You don't break the chain of command, Noah. You follow the protocol." The absurdity of the word protocol on this desolate shore snapped the last thread of his professional deference. "There is no command here, Claire, just physics and biology. If you want to survive, we need to find shelter and water now. The beacon is likely useless, and if they do search, they'll check the easier access points first." Their argument fractured what little unity the crash had forced upon them. She insisted on the wreckage. He, with a quiet stubbornness she had never encountered, started walking toward the denser brush inland. "I'll find water. You try and salvage something useful," he called back, turning his back on the CEO for the first time in his life. He hadn't been gone 30 minutes when he heard it, a sharp cry, quickly stifled. Not a command, not a complaint, but a sound of pure, helpless pain. He rushed back. Claire had tried to climb into the unstable, high section of the fuselage, likely seeking the executive food locker. Her ankle was trapped between a mangled piece of seating and the bulkhead. The look on her face wasn't fear of pain, but the terror of her own vulnerability. "Get me out, Noah," she whispered, the command replaced by a plea. He worked methodically, speaking calmly about the physics of the metal, using a broken strut to leverage the weight off her foot. When he finally freed her, the swelling was immediate, ugly, and undeniable. He didn't lecture her. He didn't even meet her eyes with judgment. He simply stripped the last clean tie from his suit jacket, tore a square from the inside of his shirt, and began to treat the sprain. He was competent, calm, and utterly focused on the task, his hands gentle on the ankle of the woman who had ruled his life for 4 years. The power dynamic between them didn't just crack, it shattered under the weight of that competence. She was helpless. He was essential. As dusk deepened and the cold fog rolled in, they worked together. Noah fashioned a rough splint for her ankle, then used broken debris and large, smooth coastal stones to build the beginnings of a meager windbreak. Claire, though immobile, directed him on which debris was structurally sound, her sharp strategic focus repurposed for survival. He brought back brackish water and the promise of a clear stream nearby. He lit a small, struggling fire. Later, huddled together against the damp cold in the pathetic shelter, she finally spoke, her voice low against the roar of the surf. "I tried to manage it like a hostile takeover," she admitted, gazing into the fire. "It's a different kind of war," Noah replied quietly. She shifted, settling a little closer for warmth. The shared exhaustion had softened the edges of her formidable armor. "You're a better soldier than I am, Noah. You knew what was real." "I just know how to disappear into the need," he thought, of his own quiet grief and the dreams he had set aside. A long silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the insistent beat of the ocean. Finally, she leaned her head back against the cold stone of the windbreak. She was the legendary Claire Hargreave, broken and beaten by a mechanical failure and a sprained ankle, and yet she had never felt more present. As they both watched the fragile structure of their survival take shape in the gloom, she spoke the words that would change everything, giving him the only thing of value she had left to offer. Quietly, into the darkness, she said, "Tomorrow, you lead." The days that followed stitched them together with exhaustion and necessity. Noah led them inland, finding a small hidden cove where a freshwater stream tumbled down the cliff face. Under his direction, they established a rhythm born not of mutual respect, but of inescapable shared circumstance. He was the architect of their immediate world, securing the stream, refining the shelter with scavenged driftwood and pine boughs, and maintaining the fire. His hands, usually busy managing complex spreadsheets and international logistics, were now skilled in the primal art of survival. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace that Claire had never suspected existed beneath his perfectly composed exterior. Claire, though largely immobile with her splinted ankle, managed the rationing. Her sharp strategic focus, once aimed at market dominance, was now bent on preserving their small, precious store of emergency rations. She knew exactly how many calories were left and how many hours they needed to stretch the supply. It was the same relentless control, just miniaturized. The walls between them began to soften, sanded down by the grit of the sand and the relentless demand of the cold. They spoke less of business and more of what they had left behind. One afternoon, watching the fire flicker, Claire finally let the armor slide completely. "The ambition," she said, her voice thin against the sound of the ocean. "It was an escape, not a drive. It was easier to build an empire than it was to fix a marriage that was already hollowed out." She didn't sound bitter, just tired. She told him how her ex-husband hadn't left for another woman, but for a smaller, quieter life, a life she simply couldn't comprehend, let alone share. "I replaced connection with control, Noah. It's a terrible trade." Noah listened, not interrupting, letting the truth breathe. When she finished, he shared his own quiet ghost. He told her about his parents, the suddenness of the loss, and the art school application he had shredded the day after the funeral. "I loved designing things," he confessed, tracing a pattern in the sand. "Spaces, buildings. But after they were gone, it felt reckless, selfish. I needed control too, a structured, predictable job where my mistakes couldn't shatter anyone's world again." He explained that working for her, being responsible for her success, had been his way of avoiding his own dreams. She had provided him with a perfect alibi for living a muted life. The shared exhaustion, the raw honesty, forged a bond that neither had ever sought. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something deeper, a mutual recognition of the hollow spaces within the other. As the days turned into the evening of several days later, the air grew thick and menacing. A violent Pacific storm, the kind that tears the landscape apart, was roaring toward them. They scrambled to secure their fragile camp, but the wind arrived first, a monstrous gale that ripped at the pine boughs and shrieked through the rocks. They huddled together in the deepest recess of the cove, the small fire struggling valiantly against the deluge. The rain began falling sideways and the shelter started to fail. Then Claire coughed, a deep, wet sound that rattled through her chest. Her injured ankle, despite Noah's meticulous care, was hot to the touch, and angry red lines were beginning to creep up her calf. Infection. The word was a silent terror between them. She shivered uncontrollably, sinking into a feverish half-sleep. It was during a terrifying lull in the storm that Noah, checking the wreckage one last time for anything salvageable, found it. Tucked deep within a scorched compartment that had somehow survived the impact, the plane's emergency locator beacon. It was dented, but the indicator light was functional. He held the cold metal object in his hands. Rescue. Immediate, loud, life-saving rescue. But outside, the storm was ramping up again. Activating the beacon now would mean immediate exposure to the elements as they waited for a response, if a helicopter could even fly in this chaos. It would draw attention to their precarious location at the worst possible moment. Noah looked back at the small cove, at Claire's feverish face, her breathing shallow and ragged. She needed warmth, darkness, and stability to fight the infection. To move her, to expose her to the elements now, even for the promise of rescue, was a gamble she might not survive. Her survival was measured in hours of quiet, stable recovery.
He made a choice, silent, absolute, and prioritizing her physical survival over immediate salvation. He turned the beacon off, tucked it back into its safe compartment, and secured the wreckage door. He returned to the shelter. He stripped off his dry outer layer and wrapped it tightly around her. He held her, lending his warmth to her shaking frame. He spoke to her in low, steady tones, a continuous anchor against the rising tide of her fever. At dawn, the storm subsided, leaving behind a pristine, exhausted silence. Claire stirred, her fever broken, her breathing slow and even. She was weak, but she had survived the night. She woke to find herself safe, wrapped tight in Noah's arms, oblivious to the momentous, life-altering choice he had made just hours before. The quiet act of betrayal committed out of a profound, sudden, and terrifying love was hidden only in the stillness of his heart. The quiet after the storm was the quiet of a shared grave or a honeymoon suite. For days, Claire was dangerously ill. The infection flared, bringing delirium and fever that washed away the last vestiges of her controlled public self. She was reduced to a primal state, a body fighting for its life. Noah was the only thing standing between her and the abyss. He spent the weeks that followed nursing her with a fierce, unwavering devotion. He hunted for the most potent local herbs, filtered water meticulously, and changed her crude dressings. He spoke to her when she was lost in the fever's grip, his voice a steady lifeline. He performed tasks that demanded an intimacy he had once desperately avoided, lifting her, keeping her clean, keeping her alive. The experience was a complete, final reversal of their original dynamic. He had always served her career. Now he was serving her life. The hierarchy was gone, replaced by the profound, simple truth that she was entirely dependent on him. One evening, by the fire, Claire, now strong enough to walk the small perimeter of their cove, was speaking again about the life she had left behind, the hollowness of her success. "I don't know who I am without the walls," she admitted, looking at the distant horizon. "The world is noisy, Noah, and I'm afraid of the noise." Noah stood behind her, placing his hands lightly on her shoulders. "You're the woman who can build a life out of sticks and stones. You're the woman who can let someone else lead." He took a steadying breath. This was the moment for truth. He said, "There's something I need to tell you," and led her back to the wreckage. He showed her the emergency locator beacon, still intact, still tucked away. He told her about the storm, the infection, and the choice he had made to keep her quiet, stable, and alive, even if it meant delaying their rescue. Claire listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, the only sound was the wind. She was conflicted. The wilderness had stripped her of fear, ego, and isolation. It had forced her to know a man who loved her fiercely and competently. Rescue meant returning to the power, the scrutiny, and the crushing loneliness she had fled. The real world was the hostile one now. They sat together on the cold sand, staring at the beacon.
It wasn't just a signal device. It was a choice between the perfect silent love they had built and the flawed, complicated world they had abandoned. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes bright and clear, reflecting the firelight. The fear of going back was immense, but the love for the man beside her was greater. Together, she simply stated, we activate it together. Noah took the beacon, walked to a prominent clear sky spot, and engaged the signal. A small, silent, but powerful light began to flash a plea into the sky. They stood, wrapped in an embrace that held all the promises of the next uncertain chapter. After hours of agonizing waiting, a distant sound, the steady thwump, thwump, thwump of rotor blades grew rapidly louder. They broke apart, looking toward the sun-drenched horizon. A rescue helicopter, a brilliant speck of modern engineering, appeared against the blue, already beginning its slow, careful descent toward the remote strip of coastline. The silence was over. The noise was coming. The return to civilization was not a gentle landing. It was an explosion. The first sound that greeted them, even before the medics, was the whir of cameras. The moment the helicopter touched down in San Francisco, they were no longer simply survivors. They were a story, a sensational, ready-made narrative packaged for immediate public consumption. The media erupted. The legendary Claire Hargreave, the impenetrable queen of venture capital, rescued alongside her young, self-effacing executive assistant Noah Reed. The speculation was immediate and brutal. Age gap, workplace ethics, power imbalance, the scandal of the Hargreave heiress and the humble helper. The noise was deafening, 1,000 voices scrutinizing the quiet, profound love they had found in the silence of the wilderness. Claire was immediately whisked away, not by family, but by her crisis management team. The firm, a vast entity built on reputation and control, demanded swift, decisive action. During the press conference, Claire was a study in practiced detachment. She spoke of the tragic loss of the flight crew, the terrifying ordeal, and the strength of her recovery. When asked pointedly about Noah, she delivered the final, chilling verdict. Mr. Reed was highly competent in assisting with immediate survival protocols, she stated, her voice even, devoid of warmth. Our relationship was and remains strictly professional. She publicly denied any connection, any feeling, any intimacy, a necessary lie to protect her firm from the corrosive scandal and the inevitable stock plunge. The words, though professionally sterile, hit Noah with the force of physical pain. He was quietly reassigned, then swiftly iced out. The isolation of the island was replaced by the far colder isolation of the modern corporate world. Emails went unanswered, calls were routed to junior staff. He was a liability, a toxic element to be managed and removed. Heartbroken, Noah retreated to his small apartment in Chicago, the city where his life had originally flattened into control. The island had given him back his heart, only for the world to crush it again. He started packing boxes, preparing to leave the city, the firm, and the person he used to be, ready to chase a completely different silence. The doorbell rang at dusk. It wasn't a messenger or a former colleague. It was Claire.
She stood on his threshold, not in her power suits, but in simple clothes that looked slightly foreign on her frame. She looked exhausted, but her eyes held the same fierce honesty that had guided them through the storm. She didn't apologize for the press conference. She didn't have to. She walked into his small, quiet living room and laid out a truth more dramatic than any press speculation. They used the scandal, she began, her voice low. The board, they saw weakness, a lapse in control. They were planning a coup, using the speculation about us as the trigger to force my resignation. She paused, looking around the room, taking in the packed boxes. They thought I would fight back, hire lawyers, crush the narrative, maintain control at all costs. Instead of fighting, she resigned. But before walking away, she had exposed the internal corruption she had spent years building a shield around. She chose truth, the complicated, messy, public truth, over the control and power she had spent her life acquiring. "I gave up the firm, Noah," she whispered. "I chose to burn the walls down." The empire was gone. The legend was just Claire, standing in his small Chicago apartment. She looked at him, not with the demand of a CEO, but with the raw uncertainty of a woman standing at the edge of a new life. "They stripped us of everything we found out there," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The solitude, the clarity, the quiet understanding. Now we have nothing but the noise, no shared threat, no survival instinct pushing us together." She stepped closer, the light from the hallway illuminating the deep vulnerability in her gaze. "Tell me, Noah," she asked, the silence of his apartment heavier than any mountain air. "Will you still choose me without the island, without survival, without the silence?" The choice was not easy. The quiet love they had found in the wilderness felt pure and absolute. The love they had to build here in the noise of the world was expensive. It cost them their reputations, their comfort, and their predictability. It cost them the silence they had grown dependent on. Noah looked at Claire, stripped bare of her titles, her power, and her armor. She had finally chosen authenticity over control, and for the first time since the night the plane went down, Noah realized he was no longer choosing to stay out of fear or out of a need for structure. He was choosing himself. "I shredded my dreams to build a safe life," he confessed, stepping toward her. "I worked for you because it was easier than working for myself. But on that island, you made me lead. You made me competent outside your shadow." He took her hands, his grip firm. "I don't need the silence anymore, Claire. I choose the truth, even if it's messy and loud." They confronted what real, unprotected love cost them. The public judgment was relentless, the future uncertain, and the process of starting over was daunting. Claire stepped into a life without the armor of ambition, facing the vulnerability of true connection. Noah stepped fully into his own purpose, reclaiming the competence and courage he had displayed only when his life was on the line. They chose each other openly. The love that followed was not the quiet, absolute fusion of two people against nature. It was an active, deliberate choice made every morning. They built a new kind of life, slowly, deliberately, and in the full, unforgiving light of the world. Claire began advising small, ethical startups, investing her strategy in meaningful growth rather than ruthless acquisition. Noah finally went back to school, enrolling in an architecture program, his quiet competence now bent toward building beauty instead of just maintaining order. They were still scrutinized, still whispered about, but the noise no longer defined them. Their foundation was built on something stronger than corporate bylaws or survival instinct. Their relationship was complicated, imperfect, and entirely their own. It was a testament to the fact that the greatest challenge is not surviving the catastrophe, but surviving the rescue. Some stories only work because someone stays until the very end. If this one stayed with you longer than you expected, if you felt the quiet parts, leave a like so it doesn't disappear. Share it with someone who understands silence. And stay here, because the stories that matter most are the ones we don't walk away from.